Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Hope that your weeks are off to a good start. So let's see. We were just putting together everyone's midterms, and so you'll be getting those back in section on either Thursday or Friday. And people did well on the midterm. The average on the midterm was 78 out of 100 points. So I think people did really well. Let's see. So those will be handed back in section. There is one more space for the lunch with Jason Furman today from the Council of Economic Advisors. So if you want to attend, please feel free to sign up for that. We're also having a guest half lecture on Thursday by Pat Byery, who is the chief economist at Amazon, which I think will be really interesting. And one thing to note is that his portion of the class will not be videoed. So just my part, the first half will be videoed, but the second half won't. So you may want to take notes during that period. Let's see. I think I had a couple. Next Thursday on the 13th, we're going to have another guest half lecture, and this time it will be by Irina Asmundsen, she is the chief economist for the state government of California. And I think she'll be helping us transition into the macro part of the course. We're going to have a lunch after class with her as well. So please, if you'd like to go to that lunch too, feel free to sign up. She received her PhD from Stanford. She worked for a number of years in Washington, D.C. at the International Monetary Fund, but she's doing some really interesting work up in Sacramento in the state's Department of Finance. Let's see. I think that is everything. So before I get started, let me just see if any of you have any questions on anything about the midterm or no questions? Anything? Okay. Any Iowa results in yet? Has anyone seen? That is very interesting that happened last night. So last time at the end of class, I went through things pretty quickly. I'm just going to give a very quick overview of those concepts that we covered before switching into monopoly. So last time we talked about perfect competition, which is kind of one extreme. When you think about markets, you can have many firms competing, and that sort of mimicking perfect competition as we described before. Today, we're going to spend most of the class talking about the opposite extreme, which is monopoly, when there's only one firm operating in a market, and thinking about how things are going to go in that case. I just inserted in the slides from the last class here, one thing that you want to, how do I do this? There we go. One thing that, does someone want to take a stab at articulating what the shutdown point is? Or the zero profit point? I can throw this to the back. I could just throw this randomly. Oh, here we go. Yeah? Yeah. No, I don't think so. That's a little dangerous. Yeah, you watching? It's coming.
Okay. The zero profit point is when marginal cost equals...
Sorry, can you start again?
The zero profit point is when marginal cost equals average total cost.
Average variable cost?
Average variable cost, I'm sorry.
Did you say the shutdown point?
No, the zero profit point is average total cost, right?
Yeah, where it equals average total cost. Yeah, that's right. And it's the minimum of that point. There's only one. If we're in a situation where marginal cost is falling and then rising, you're going to have basically average variable cost and average cost curves that look like that. So, and if you were a firm in this industry and the price were down here, would you want to keep operating?
No.
Okay. What if the price were in here?
You would keep operating in the short term and then shut down in the long term.
And then shut down in the long run. Right, exactly. Okay. So that's really important. And basically, what's going to happen in any industry is that things are going to gravitate towards a situation. If you have a perfectly competitive industry where firms are free to enter and exit, the market equilibrium is going to gravitate to the point where the price is equal to the minimum of the average cost. Because if the price were higher than that amount, that would create a profitable opportunity where firms would enter in to try to take advantage and make those profits. And that would tend to reduce the quantity that all of the other firms have, nudging them back towards this point, and similarly giving some negative price pressure. If instead the price were here, and let's suppose all the firms are identical, this is like an extreme example. If the price were here, the opposite would happen. Some firms would decide to shut down and exit once they had an opportunity to renew their lease, let's say, and that would therefore end up leading to more quantity for different firms, pushing them back towards this point. So really, there's like this gravity, and no industry is truly perfectly competitive. There's going to be always some kind of imperfections. But in those industries where there is a lot of competition, there's this kind of gravitational pull towards the industry ending up at the point where the price is equal to the average cost, where no firms want to exit who are in the industry, and no firms want to enter who could potentially enter. So this is summarized here. In the long run of a perfectly competitive industry, price is equal to marginal revenue, it's equal to the marginal cost, it's equal to average cost. Price is equal to marginal revenue because all firms are price takers in a perfectly competitive industry. When we get into monopoly, you're going to see that price is not equal to marginal revenue. And I'll go through that in just a few minutes. But this, in the long run equilibrium, no additional firms want to enter, nor do any incumbents want to exit. And in reality, there will often be shocks to a market, shocks up in demand, shocks down in demand, let's say. And so you may, in the long run, additional firms may enter or exit. So if demand surges, you may see a lot of entry, because if demand surges in the short run, price is going to go up. That's going to create a profitable opportunity. Firms want to enter and take advantage of that. And so we went through an example where we had a situation where firms would either operate at a quantity of 10 or 11, which corresponded to an average cost of 15, where the price was price was going to gravitate towards this minimum of average cost in the long run of 15. And if firms were producing 10 or 11, and if at price of 15, the market level demand were 1,100, then we'd have about 100 firms, okay? So you're going to have a question in your problem set about this, about what is the long run equilibrium, how many firms are there, and this part right here is going to be helpful to you for that. And the implications for efficiency is that in the long run equilibrium, the price is going to be equal to the minimum of average cost. So you're basically pushing output up to the point where people value it exactly equal the price, and that is the cost to the firm of producing it. So that is going to be the efficient amount of quantity. We've got a question right in front of, right. Yeah, can you grab the microphone ball? Okay, yeah. Fire away.
Why, as firms enter and exit, is the demand of the market shifting rather than the supply, since like more firms equals more supply?
Right. No, I'm saying that if you have a market level demand curve, and let's suppose we're at an equilibrium where there are 100 firms, like that example before, and then suddenly the demand surges, what's going to happen is essentially you're going to see more firms entering, and supply is going to rise to meet that increase in demand. Okay. Great question. Yeah, I think there was another question here. What do you think? Okay, great.
So regarding the point, like if there was a supply shock or like a demand increase, wouldn't it be true that instead of like the price increasing or decreasing, rather it's like the marginal cost of the firm that increases or decreases, and then in the short run, and then in the long run, there would be a new equilibrium price that gets established?
Right, but in the long run, you're still going to end up at this point where the price is equal to the minimum of average cost, because if you ended up at a point where the price was higher than that, that creates profitable opportunities for firms to enter. Do you know what I mean? So there's this, it looks enticing for firms to enter, and that's going to tend to drive down the price and basically pull away some of the demand from the incumbents until you get to a point where the price is equal to 15.
So that firms exiting or entering, that's part of the long run activity.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay,
so
okay.
There's a shock to demand. Let's suppose we've got 100 firms. There's this big surge in demand, a 50% increase in demand or something. In the short run, those firms start making a lot of money. They're going to produce where output is above, where they're going to push output above, let's say, 10 or 11 in the short run, but then other firms that are out there, potential entrants, are going to see this profitable opportunity. They're going to enter, and it's going to drive things back towards the equilibrium where price is the minimum of average cost. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, other questions on this? Right over here. Do you think you can? Pretty good. Almost, yeah. Okay, great.
So I understand the reasoning behind the optimal point being when the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, but why does that have to equal the average cost? Like, what makes that most optimal?
No, I mean, a firm would love it if they could produce at a point where the price was much far above the average cost. But that wouldn't be an equilibrium. So if we went to this example and firms were pushing, like price was, let's say, 18 or 19 or 20, and firms were pushing output up to this point, let's say, then they'd be making a lot of money because price would be far in excess of average cost. But that creates, we're assuming that this is a perfectly competitive industry where firms can freely enter and exit. So if you see 100 firms in this industry that are making money hand over fist, let's say, then more companies are going to enter in. And that's going to tend to drive down the price because you're increasing the total amount that's being supplied to the market. And so that's going to pull demand away from the incumbent firms and basically up to the point, and that's going to continue to happen until they've driven the price all the way down to 15. So it may be that you go from 100 firms to, think of, let's say, suppose the restaurant industry in Palo Alto was perfectly competitive, and for a while the restaurants are making a fortune, making really a lot of money because, let's say, there's a huge increase in the number of students that Stanford admitted one year. And so there was this big increase in demand. You might see then entry by new firms, and that would tend to lower the quantity for the incumbent firms. And basically that profitable opportunity would exist and would continue to entice firms until the point where where the profits were driven to zero, where the economic profits were driven to zero. And if price is above that point, there's an opportunity, so additional firms want to enter.
Right, but why is the minimum point on the average cost curve, why does that have to be the equilibrium point where the marginal cost crosses?
Because if it's any other point, if it's up here, let's suppose that price, like this is the marginal cost. Let's suppose price is up here. Okay, so price is up here. This firm is making money. Its competitors are making money. And then some other potential competitor comes out and it enters and pulls some quantity away from this firm, which is going to nudge the demand back ultimately towards this point. As long as the price is up here, there's a profitable opportunity and firms want to enter and basically, and they want to keep entering until the profits are driven down to zero. Whereas if instead the price were down here, some incumbent firms, when their fixed costs are up and they, let's say, have to renew their lease or something, they're not going to renew it, and that's going to tend to increase the demand for the remaining firms and increase their quantity. Hopefully that helps. But it's good to, I mean, this is a complicated concept. Like I can remember learning this for the first time. It was somewhat of an elusive concept for me. So I think continuing to sort of look at this, and I think OpenStax, as I said last class, if there's any one class all quarter where I would recommend supplementing the lecture notes and the video of the class or this presentation, that I think the last class is a good one. Chapters 7 and 8 in OpenStax I think are quite good. Okay, not that 1 through 6 wasn't good also, but just I think it's more helpful to get through some of these difficult concepts. But just it's a suppose otherwise kind of argument. Suppose otherwise, if price is above this point, then there's a profitable opportunity. Firms want to enter. That pulls quantity away from the incumbents, and it drives the price down. And suppose it's here, some incumbent firms want to exit. That's the only point that can be an equilibrium where no one, remember, the important thing about an equilibrium is no potential firms want to enter and no incumbent firms want to exit. And the only place that is true is right there, is the minimum of the average cost. Okay, other questions on this? Okay, so I'm going to run now. And so this is the implications for efficiency. Price is a measure of consumers' willingness to pay. And to the extent, so at the market equilibrium, the price is equal to the marginal cost. And this is going to be an efficient point in the sense that it's costing firms basically for that last unit of production exactly P to make the product, and that's exactly what consumers value it at. So you're getting to that final bit of surplus. If instead consumers valued it at 2P and firms were only pushing up to the point where the price, the marginal cost of them was P, we should increase output somewhat more to realize more surplus. Okay. So now I'm going to switch to monopoly. So this is the exact opposite extreme to perfectly competitive markets. And a monopoly is basically the only firm, and in reality, most industries in the US and around the world are between these two extremes. They're not perfectly competitive, they're not monopolies, there's some intermediate case. And so we're going to talk about that intermediate case later today. So if you have a monopoly, it's the only firm that provides a good or service that doesn't have a close substitute. And what is completely different about monopolies from perfectly competitive firms is whereas perfectly competitive firms just take the price, they look out at the world, they see what the price is. If you make tennis balls, you look out at the world, supposing the market for tennis balls is perfectly competitive, it's $3, a dollar per tennis ball, you take that price as given. If instead you're the only producer, then you can set the price, essentially. And you can pick what point on the demand curve you want to set your quantity at. And what we're going to see is that a monopoly is optimally going to set price above marginal cost, sometimes substantially above marginal cost, in order to maximize its profits. And what we'll see is there's kind of an inefficiency associated with that, because if the firm lowered its price a bit more, people would be willing to pay, and it would be that price would be above the marginal cost. There's some surplus that doesn't get realized when the firm chooses to set price above marginal cost, and we'll talk through that. This is very different from the case where competitive firms produced up to the point where the marginal cost was equal to the price, and in thinking about this, I think one of the hardest things to do when you're like looking at industries is to define what constitutes the market. Okay, so it's relatively easy for something like, let's say, airlines, United, American, Delta, Southwest, British Airways, and so forth. It gets relatively harder, though, for some other things. Take like Whole Foods. Is it competing with Safeway, or is it just competing, or is it sort of on its own? Similarly, is Facebook, who's the competitor for Facebook? So this idea of a market definition, we're going to talk about that more as we go through the class today. And here is a view this was from a Wall Street Journal editorial about 5.5 years ago from the difference between monopoly and competition. So Peter Thiel, he was one of the original funders of Facebook. He was a founder of PayPal. And so I'm just going to read through this. What valuable company is nobody building? This question is harder than it looks because your company could create a lot of value without being very valuable itself. Creating value isn't enough. You also need to capture some of the value that you create. This means that even very big businesses can be bad businesses. For example, US airlines serve millions of passengers and create hundreds of billions of dollars of value each year. But in 2012, when the average airfare each way was $178, the airlines made only 37 cents per passenger trip. Compare them to Google, which creates less value but captures far more. Google brought in $50 billion in 2012, and it kept 21% of those revenues as profits, more than 100 times the airline industry's profit margin that year. Google's makes this is even more true now than it was 5.5 years ago. Google makes so much money that it is now worth 3 times more than every US airline combined. The airlines compete with each other, but Google stands alone. Economists use 2 simplified models to explain the difference: perfect competition and monopoly. So to some extent, what he is arguing here is that, if you're going to start up a new business, you should try to start in a place where basically you're sort of closer to this situation than this situation here. Okay? Okay, so the potential drivers and disruptors of monopoly, why does monopoly exist? There are barriers to entry that may prevent entry by additional firms. So entry is the market. So with perfect competition, entry was the mechanism through which profits get driven towards zero. But there may be some barrier to entering. So for example, for a long time, De Beers, which is a company that mines diamonds, owned most of the diamond mines in the world. If you want to enter into the industry to, let's say, manufacture diamonds, it's hard if you don't have access to diamond mines. So that's an example of a barrier to entry that could exist. Network effects may also nudge industries toward monopoly. So think of Facebook, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, Microsoft, with Microsoft like Word and Excel. As more people use Facebook, or as more people use Uber, or as more people use Microsoft Word, it increases the benefits to other people of using that same product. And so this partially explains why, and you'll see in your reading this week, which has been uploaded, an article from The Economist right around the same time as the Thiel editorial that goes through the economics of these network effects. And so this is the people who study, let's say, the tech industry argue that these network effects were hugely important in explaining why Facebook grew so rapidly and now has 2.7 billion users globally. So I think 35% of people on the planet have Facebook or Instagram or both or what have you. So, so those network effects can be very, very powerful. Do you think Facebook is a monopoly? Is Facebook? I mean, I don't have a rigid view on this, but people often today's presentation actually at CEPR by Jason Furman, he's going to talk about regulating the tech giants and whether. So today is actually a good day for him to be presenting because there's a lot of interest in Washington D.C. and around the world in Europe and in other places about potentially regulating companies like Facebook and Google somewhat more than they're currently being. Okay, so another possible explanation for monopoly, why some industries look more like a monopoly. Sorry. Another explanation is natural monopoly. So it could be that the market demand, and this is easiest to see on this next figure, suppose that the entire demand in a market is this line and that it intersects the firm's cost curve at a point where average cost is still declining. You're not necessarily going to have 2 or 3 or 4 firms because if you did, average costs would be a lot higher potentially, and that would be much less efficient. So this is an example. Sometimes people talk about a trade-off between, if you get fewer, if this is what the cost functions look like, it's not obvious that you would want to have 2 or 3 or 4 firms competing in this industry because then it might be much, much, much more expensive for them to make it than to just have this one firm making it at this lower price here. Okay? So that's another reason that we could have a monopoly. And then there are legal monopolies. So if you look at electricity or water, people don't usually have like 7 different choices about who they're going to get their electricity from or who they're going to get their water from. And so but these are often highly regulated. These aren't like profit maximizing firms like Google who are providing water. These are often regulated by the government, partly to avoid really high prices for people. This is the area of this reason here. Patents is something that I've thought a bunch about in my research. These give innovators exclusive rights for up to 20 years. So we have in the US a pretty large pharmaceutical industry where companies make treatments for all sorts of medical conditions, for diabetes, for cancer, for high cholesterol, for depression, for lots of different things. And many of these treatments, the company discovered a new possible treatment. They went through clinical trials, let's say with the Food and Drug Administration, that proved that they were safe and that they were potentially effective. And then they get the right to sell these products at whatever price they want for up to 20 years. Okay, and so this is a really tricky area to think about because it's that opportunity to be a monopoly that gives a very powerful incentive to pharmaceutical companies to try to find a cure for cancer, to try to find a better treatment for depression, to try to find a treatment that helps people manage their diabetes better. So this is a policy issue that we're going to talk a lot about, I think, in the next class. Patents giving innovators exclusive rights for up to 20 years, and there's copyright and other forms of IP protection. Okay? And there has been deregulation over the years of some natural monopolies, but this is like, you can think of sort of 4 different sets of things here as reasons, as potential drivers of monopoly. Okay, so this is an example of a firm with something. No firm necessarily has a perfect monopoly, but there's this company called Monsanto, which has patents on a number of seeds that are used by farmers around the world. So in the US, GMOs are overwhelmingly dominant here among the major crops, representing more than 90% of corn, soybean, cotton, sugar beets, and canola. And Monsanto holds huge shares of those markets. About 80% of US corn and more than 90% of US soybeans are grown with seeds containing Monsanto's patented seed traits. So this is an example of a company that has lots and lots of patents and which has a lot of, as a result, has a lot of pricing power because their seeds are considered to be superior to those made by many of its competitors. And so they're a pretty big company. As you can see, in 2013, they had sales of about $15 billion. Okay, and then finally, this is a couple of paragraphs that are taken from your assigned reading from The Economist about internet monopolies. And basically, this sort of goes through, a clever startup does not try to compete directly with an incumbent. It picks a seemingly unimportant market which it can monopolize. And so this article is really interesting. It goes through the network effects that we talk about. It talks about Facebook, talks about Amazon, talks some about Google, about LinkedIn, which is the world's biggest social network for professionals with, at this point, over 300 million registered users. It's far larger now. And so this is just some background information on these things. And then finally, here's an article from, there was an article last week in the Wall Street Journal saying that, an editorial arguing that the government, the federal government in the US should do more to regulate technology companies. And I mean, it's a little tricky to think about because if I have a Facebook account, I'm not paying anything to Facebook. And if I use the Google search engine, I'm not paying anything to Google, but they are collecting data on me and using that as advertising. And so the use of that information can be very powerful for them. Not everyone agrees that Facebook, Google, or Amazon, as powerful as they are now, will need to be reined in. So how much, whether and to what extent to regulate these companies that are now worth, I think between the 3 of them, they're now worth about over $2 trillion, which is a lot. And so some people argue, so there's this, in this article, this person pointed out that you don't have to regulate them because Amazon, yeah, they're really profitable today, but it won't be long before some other competitor comes along and knocks them out of out of their top position, very few companies will be able to position themselves for the new next technology every time. And so we will, Facebook and Amazon and Google are sort of have grown massively over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. But it's different than the monopoly, let's say, for the pharmaceutical treatment in these cases. Okay, so I've talked a lot and I haven't asked for any questions, so I'm going to pause here for a second. Do you have the microphone? Oh, no, it's back over here. Okay, great. Okay. Trust me.
Would you mind clarifying for the natural monopoly, how, in the natural monopoly, like if more than one firm joins in, like when the demand is below the efficient point, why would that drive up average costs?
Great question. Okay, so let's go back to that figure. So here is, you're talking about this figure right here, right?
Yep.
Okay, so suppose that this is the entire market demand, and I'm just going to put in I'm going to extend the cost curve how I think it would, let's say, go. So suppose the cost curve would go like this. Okay, and we got probably 5,000 units of output at this equilibrium, and this is just one firm producing, right? And so at that point, the average cost, if it's 5,000 of production, the average cost, let's say, is, I don't know, 90. Okay? So now let's suppose instead that of having one firm produce 5,000 units, we had two firms each produce 2,500. Okay, that would be an alternative way to get an output of 5,000, right? Then up here, and maybe this point up here is 125 or something. You know what I mean? So it's much more costly for two firms to make this product than for just one firm to make it, because we're basically at a point where economies of scale are still driving down average cost, even if only one firm is making the product.
Wouldn't it be true, like on the other side of like in the economies of scale portion?
Right, so they're realizing economies of scale here. They're getting more, the costs are going down as they produce more, right? This is diseconomies of scale out here, and this is just flat. There's it's constant returns to scale in that region right there.
Okay, so this is basically all contingent upon the fact that the demand of 5,000 is sort of like fixed, right? Like
Well, I mean, there's a demand curve, so it's not fixed. It's going to depend on what the price is, right? So, but it usually, like in the examples that we had thought of earlier, we were thinking that demand was much greater than the point where a firm's reached its minimum average cost, right? So when we had this earlier example here, we were saying that gravity is pulling firms towards this point right there. In that case, we went through an example where we were going to have like 100 firms. So the total market demand was massively higher than the point at which firms minimized average cost. Whereas in this case, the total market demand is below a quantity where they would minimize their average cost.
I see, okay.
Yeah, hopefully that
Thank
helps. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions on this? Okay. Okay, so now I want to go through a little bit of the math behind how a monopoly tries to optimize in its economic environment. So what's different for a monopoly, the opposite, the extreme that we talked about last time was perfectly competitive firms. And we basically said that a perfectly competitive firm looks out at the world, sees what the price is, okay, and then makes a production decision, a decision about production. Okay, when you're a monopolist, you get to decide both price and quantity. Okay, or you basically, because you pick which point along the demand curve you want to produce at. So when you choose the price, you're also choosing the quantity. And we tend to think there's some market level demand curve for any product, let's say that is downward sloping. Okay, and this monopolist is going to push output up to the point where that last little bit of revenue from one more unit of output is exactly equal to the marginal cost of that point. If marginal revenue is below marginal cost, it should produce less because it's losing money on that last unit of production. If instead it's greater, if marginal revenue is greater, suppose by producing one more unit I get 15 more in revenue, but it only costs me 10, I should keep producing because I can make additional money on further output, okay? But marginal revenue, in this case, in contrast to last time, is not simply the price, okay? Because this firm has the ability to affect each additional unit of output, there's a trade-off that a monopolist faces. If they produce a bit more, they get more quantity, but they have to have a lower price for their existing customers too. Okay, so there's a trade-off that a monopolist faces in making a decision about what price to choose. And as we're going to see, the marginal revenue curve essentially lies below the demand curve. So there's a trade-off for this firm, and we'll go through this now. So this is the difference between a perfect competitor. They basically just think that there's a constant price P. Whatever amount they produce, they're going to get that same price of P. So if I'm one of 100 companies that makes tennis balls, I can produce as many tennis balls as I want at $1 per tennis ball, but I can't choose whether the price is going to be $1.50 or 50 cents. Okay? I'm just a price taker. In contrast, for a monopolist, they're looking at the whole market level demand curve. So if they're thinking about increasing output from the low quantity to the high quantity, then they're going to have a lower price as a result of that. Okay, so I'll go through a specific example of this. Let's consider a demand curve, and let's show graphically this demand curve. Here's the quantity, here's the price, and we have a demand curve of 20 minus Q, so we're going to start up here at 20. It's going to come all the way down to 20. Okay, so that's the demand curve for this product where this firm is, let's say, a monopolist. And suppose that they right now are producing only 3 units. So the price would be 17 if they were deciding to produce 3 units. Okay, this could be treatment for high cholesterol, on which the firm has a patent. Okay, and the firm is trying to decide right now, do they want to go from 3 to 4 units of output? If they increase their output from 3 units to 4 units, okay, they get more quantity, but they're going to get a lower price. And you can show this basically. Okay, so this rectangle right here is the revenue they lose when they increase quantity by 1. So they instead of getting 17 for those first 3 customers, they're only getting 16 now. But this is the gain. This is a much bigger rectangle where they gain revenue. Okay? So when the firm goes from 3 units, when the price is 17, to 4 units, the price is 16, the revenue goes up. Their revenue goes up. Whereas if instead they had been down at this point, let's say where the price was 5 and the quantity was 15, if they thought of adding another unit of output down there, the lost revenue would be much bigger than the gain in revenue. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for them to increase output, if you're a monopolist, from 15 to 16, because not only are your costs going up with producing another unit, but you're also getting less revenue because you're getting much less money for each customer. I think up here, this is the elastic part of the demand curve, whereas down here, this is the inelastic part of the demand curve. And it's only at this point, halfway down, where those two things are going to exactly balance. So if you think about the quantity of 10 and that has a price of 10, basically those two rectangles are exactly the same size, if you think of an infinitesimal change in either direction. Okay, now I want to add in a fixed cost to this example and then think through. So we still have 20 minus Q as the market level demand for this product. And so we're thinking of all the different quantities that they could choose all the way down to 19. Okay? So if they have a quantity of 1, the price there is going to be 19, and that's going to be their total revenue. At a price of 2, the price would be 18, so their revenue would be equal to 36. At 3, the price would be 17, 51, and so forth. Okay, and you see this is the point where they get the highest revenue, 10 units of production and 10 units of production with a price of 10. And it's not a coincidence that that is exactly halfway down the demand curve. Okay, so that's the exact midpoint right here. 10, 10 is the point where this monopolist would maximize their revenue. Okay, but they're not trying to necessarily maximize their revenue. As we said at the beginning of class last time, we assume that firms are trying to maximize their profits. Okay, so as they're increasing the quantity that they produce, their costs are going up. And so we're assuming here just a marginal cost of 3 plus Q. Okay, so for the marginal cost for that first unit is 4, for the second unit is 5, for the third unit is 6, and so forth. And so I'm keeping track over here of the total cost for this firm. And what we're going to find is that they're going to push their output up to the point where the marginal revenue, that last little bit of revenue from an additional unit, is equal to the marginal cost. That's where their profits are going to be maximized. Okay, so the firm wants to push quantity pushing quantity up to the point where the marginal revenue from an additional unit is equal to the marginal cost. Okay, and I want to go through this now and just go through a quick example of this. We're going to have a different demand curve, 100 minus Q, a marginal cost of 10 plus Q. And what this firm is going to do to optimize is set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And you'll see from this figure that the marginal revenue is falling more rapidly than the price is falling. It turns out that the marginal revenue is twice as steep as the demand curve. I'll draw that in right now. So here's Q, here's P. We're starting at 100, and we're going down to 100. Okay, so this is the demand curve. The marginal revenue is the incremental revenue from one more unit of output, okay? And that marginal revenue is going to be twice as steep as the demand curve. Instead of a slope of -1, it's going to be a slope of -2. It's going to go to this point right here. It's going to intersect at a quantity of 50. At a quantity of 50, the marginal revenue is exactly 0. The gain that you get from producing a little more, the revenue gain is perfectly offset, as we saw in this example here when we were halfway down the demand curve of 20 minus Q. You see that basically at this point, that's where the marginal revenue, if you produce another unit, starts to become negative. Marginal revenue is -1, -3, once you get further than halfway down the linear demand curve. Okay, and we're going to be doing linear demand curves for the most part. If you go into Econ 50 and 51, you would do, you'd potentially deviate from the linearity, but we're going to be using, when we're solving these kinds of problems, we're going to be using a linear demand curve, okay? And so I've set the marginal cost equal to 10 plus Q. So 10 is pretty far down here. It's 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. So 10 is here, and I want that to intersect at about here. So this is marginal cost. This is marginal revenue. Where do these two intersect? 100 minus 2Q is equal to the marginal cost of 10 plus Q. I get that 3Q is equal to 90, and that Q is equal to 30. And at Q of 30, the price that the monopolist is charging consumers is going to be 70. They're located at this point right here. The price is equal to 70, Q is equal to 30. And I'm going to draw in these different areas here. Consumer surplus is this area right here. Okay, because they're paying, so you've got a consumer who's willing to pay like 99 for this product, so that consumer, when they buy it, is getting 29 units of surplus. Okay, so that's the surplus to consumer. So CS is equal to, and this is happening at a quantity of 30, CS is equal to a half times 30 times 100 minus 70. That's 30 times 30, 900, it's 450. Producer surplus is much, much bigger than consumer surplus here. Okay? The producer surplus is this whole area here. I'm ignoring fixed costs for right now, so there may be fixed costs in the background. Okay, but this area right here is equal to the producer surplus. The producer surplus is equal to, first there's a square here, 30 times 70 minus 40, plus this triangle right here, which is a half times 40 minus 10 times 30. So this is 900 plus 450, or 1350. So producers here, I'm going through that math kind of quickly, but the producer surplus is 3 times greater than the consumer surplus in this example, okay? But there's an inefficiency here, and what is the inefficiency associated with a monopoly? Anyone want to take a stab at this before we'll break in just a couple minutes? Okay, right here, where's the microphone ball? I forget where it's at. Can someone tell me who's got them? Oh, you got it right there. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah?
So I'm thinking like when in monopoly the prices rise, the quantity decrease. So like, so there's like some of the transaction that could have happened in a natural equilibrium that cannot happen in the case of monopoly. So there's like inefficiency.
Can you show it to me? Can you describe it to me on the graph?
So like that like triangle right there would be
Yeah.
that way loss, right?
So this right here, this triangle right here, represents the deadweight loss from underproduction by this monopoly. Okay? Great, thanks for that. So basically, if the firm produced a 31st unit, it would only cost them 41 to make, and that consumer is willing to pay $69 for that unit. So there's surplus of 28 that you're sacrificing by not producing that 31st unit. Similarly, the 32nd unit would cost the firm 42 to make it. there's someone willing to pay 68 for it, but it's not being produced, so there's an inefficiency from this monopoly from underproduction, okay? And this is part of the reason that regulators don't like monopolies, because you end up getting too little output that is inefficiently low. And also, you see here, consumers are getting much less of the surplus here than producers. Okay, so the deadweight loss, though, to calculate that would just be the area of that triangle, a half times the base of the triangle, 70 minus 40, and the height of the triangle, which is, I believe, 45. So this is hit this point right here. What happened at 45? Happened at 45. 45 minus 30. That's equal to 15 times 15, which is equal to 225. So there's a lot of producer surplus is 1350, consumer surplus is 450, and the deadweight loss is 225. So why don't we stop there for 8 minutes and come back in a little bit, and feel free to come up with questions if you have any right now. Okay, let's get started. So this example of deadweight loss and basically output being below the efficient point. So the efficient point would have output getting pushed all the way up to the point where the amount that very last consumer is willing to pay for that final unit is just a bit above what it costs the firm to make it. So the efficient point would be here, where total surplus would be, you would get back this rectangle of surplus that is not realized. And then additionally, consumers would get some of that surplus that producers are currently having. So right now, in this example, producer surplus is 3 times higher than consumer surplus from this market, and the deadweight loss is about half of what the consumer surplus is. If we went to basically, if we got this whole area, so it'd be a half times 90 times 45, 2025, I think is 17, 18, 2025. So if you added up, the total possible surplus in this market is the area of this giant triangle here. Okay, and we're losing some of that surplus, this shaded area here, this deadweight loss. Okay, so you can do it. This deadweight loss can be bigger for products where the marginal cost is low, and so this is especially relevant when you think about pharmaceutical treatments. It costs almost nothing to make the typical pill. Okay, so imagine we have an industry where the marginal cost of producing a unit is just 4, as opposed to 10 plus Q, which it was before, and we still have that 100 minus Q, demand, market level demand. Okay, so in this example, this is demand, 100 minus Q. Marginal revenue is twice as steep. Guess this intersects at 50. This is marginal revenue, 100 minus 2Q. Okay, just twice the slope. And then we've got a marginal cost down here of just 4. And it's a constant marginal cost. Okay, in this example, if the firm sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, basically setting 100 minus 2Q equal to 4, 2Q equal to 96, Q is equal to 48, and P is equal to 52. Okay, and so that is happening right here at this point, where Q is 48. Price up here is 52. So the producer surplus in this example is a rectangle, or a square actually. The producer surplus here is going to be 52 minus 4 times 48, so it's just 48 squared, which is equal to 2304. Consumer surplus is going to be exactly half that amount. Half 100 minus 52 times 48, so it's, I think, 1150, 1152. But the deadweight loss in this example is going to loom larger. It's going to be bigger than before. It's this area of this triangle here. And the deadweight loss is going to turn out to be a half times 52 minus 4 times, this thing is intersecting right here at 96. 96 minus 48, it's just 48 squared, half 48 squared, which is also 1152. So deadweight loss here is substantial. And this is only thinking about things from an efficiency perspective as opposed to also from a distributional perspective. This, you can think about the distributional effects if we're thinking of, let's say, drugs, pharmaceutical treatments to treat a certain illness. You may have people whose willingness to pay is down here. They may have a relatively low willingness to pay, maybe because they have low income or they don't have health insurance. Okay, and so when the monopoly is pricing up at this point at a price of 52, there are a lot of people, potentially lower income people, who are not able to get the product. Okay, so this kind of issue has come up a lot in terms of with pharmaceuticals because there are treatments that are available that could dramatically reduce illness burden in some countries, but if the price is kept this high, it's unavailable to people in those countries. So it is. I'm going to pause there for a second because I went through a lot of stuff before the break, and this is an important concept. So this right here is the deadweight loss again. So in this case, this is deadweight loss. And by the way, when we were calculating the producer surplus, we're omitting the fixed costs. But if you want to know the firm profits also incorporate the fixed costs. So you could have substantial producer surplus, but maybe there's a big fixed cost. So profits are somewhat lower than that. Okay, so we've got deadweight loss there. We've got consumer surplus here, and producer surplus for the square. Okay, any questions on this? Yeah, we got a question over here. Can I try? I don't know if she's, hey, okay. Great, good job.
You talked about how when more quantity is produced, price drops. Why would that be the case if they're price setters, like monopolies?
Right, great question. They can't, the market level demand curve for a monopolist, that's their demand curve. So they have to pick a combination of price and quantity that is on that demand curve. So you know what I mean? Like they can't make people want to pay certain amounts. So they have the power to set the price, but they can't also set the quantity. They've got to pick the price, the PQ combination that they like the most. Okay, so this is we've gone through some sort of abstract example of monopolies. I wanted to go. There are lots of examples of this, especially with healthcare treatments. Okay, but there are many other examples too. But I came upon this example a while ago, which is I thought was interesting. So there's a company called Mylan which makes EpiPens. EpiPen is something that I know about because my son needs to have an EpiPen with him all the time because of his his allergies. And if you look, they come in 2 packs for these injectors, and these release epinephrine to stop an allergic reaction. And it's pretty striking that if you look over time, this firm didn't really have a monopoly in 2007, but then for various reasons, competitors have fizzled over the years. The Twinject was discontinued in 2012. The LVQ was recalled in 2015 because of the danger it would administer the wrong dose. And so basically Mylan acquired EpiPen in 2007. It had a total market of about $207 million a year. It was a dominant product then, but it's become even more dominant over time. But if you look over a 9-year period at the price of EpiPen after it was acquired by Mylan, so Mylan benefited from factors including failed competitors, patent protections, and laws requiring allergy medications in school. Having a virtual monopoly has facilitated the rapid price hike. So this was a pretty incredible price increase from $94 in February 2007 to $609 just 9 years later for the exact same product. Okay, and the CEO of this company ended up having to go before Congress. The price has since come down somewhat, but it's a pretty staggering price change in a short period of time. And this is a treatment that is, it's really expensive, but a lot of people absolutely need it for the risk that they'll have an allergic reaction of some type. And this is kind of monopoly it's basically an industry going from having somewhat more of a competitive equilibrium to having a monopoly. Okay, so yeah, we got a question over here. Oh, hurts. Can you pass by half? Yeah, no problem. Great, thanks. Great throw. Where was? Okay, you trust me?
Okay, cool. I'm confused why there are barriers to entry for this monopoly, because there's clearly
You mean EpiPen?
Yeah, EpiPen, because there were other EpiPen companies before, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure why they aren't continue. I don't know why companies wouldn't produce EpiPens other than this one.
Yeah, I think the injector, I think they have, my understanding, and I don't have a perfect knowledge of all this, but that's a great question. My understanding is that they have a patent on the injector, and the injector of competitor products, because of the danger it would administer the wrong dose. I think the injectors for competitors didn't work as well as for the EpiPen, and I'm not sure if it's a bit of a mystery to me too how it could have gone from being pretty competitive here to this kind of a price rise. So I think that it was partly because this Twinject was not doing well. So another similar product, the Twinject, this was even in 2007, had 10 million in sales, and physicians said the device was a little clumsier and not as appealing to patients. So there was a competitor, and maybe at the time, whoever was making EpiPen before it was acquired by Mylan, whoever was making it thought things were more competitive than they were. Do you know what I mean? They may have sort of had a monopoly and not realized it. All of this is in theory, what firms should do, but often firms may not optimize, or maybe the firm wasn't profit maximizing, and it got acquired by this company Mylan, and it's pretty remarkable though the price increase that occurred thereafter, and so and I think there probably were quite a few families who were making the choice of can I afford to get another, because the EpiPens expire as well. And so can I get an EpiPen, or if you're low income, you're really low income, this is a high price. But I'm puzzled that there wasn't more entry to pull this down. And I think the injectors must just be, it must be a hard thing to come up with a different way that isn't infringing on the patent that Mylan had for this injector. So I don't know if that's I'm not fully satisfied with my answer, but yeah, that's what I got. Yeah, okay, hopefully that helps. Okay, so let's do an example of a problem from a previous midterm with a monopoly kind of example. So this is taken from spring 2015 midterm 2. We were thinking about De Beers, which makes diamonds, and we're going to assume that it has a monopoly in the market for diamonds. For a long time, that was a pretty good assumption, although it is less true today, but market level demand is 110 minus Q. Neither P nor Q can be less than 0, and their marginal cost of producing diamonds is 10. Okay, so we want to graph the total market demand curve, being sure to label intercepts and the slope. So if we have 110 minus Q, P, 110 is the vertical intercept. Slope is -1, so it just goes down to 110 here. So that is the graph that's, we've got to label the slope. Slope is -1. Okay. Solve for De Beer's profit maximizing level of production and the corresponding price. So can someone walk us through this? Pass that to me. Do you want to try?
Oh,
You've got it. You've got it.
sure. So it's profit maximizing when the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Couldn't have said it better myself. What's marginal revenue? If the demand is 110 minus Q,
Is that just the equation for marginal revenue, so we could equal that to 10 and solve?
yeah, so what
Thank
it,
you.
so that is true. So marginal revenue equals marginal cost. What's the margin? So we know marginal cost is 10.
Yeah.
What's the marginal revenue? Anyone? Can take a step? Do you have it? Two people behind you, so can you pass it back?
So then the marginal revenue should it should just decrease twice as fast, so it should just be 110 minus 2Q.
Yeah, 110 minus 2Q. So we've got 2Q is equal to 100.
So Q equals 50.
Q is equal to 50, and P
Plug
is
that
equal,
into the demand
P
curve.
is equal to 60.
Yeah.
Okay, so the price is 6 times higher than the marginal cost in this market. That's a pretty big, you can think of that. Sometimes economists talk about markups. What is the markup of price over cost? In this case, there's a markup of about 500% over the cost, right? It costs 6 times what it costs. The price is 6 times higher than the cost. So there's a pretty significant markup in this market. Now, using the graph, so remember these two, price is equal to 60 and quantity is equal to 50. Let's calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus. So we said we were going to go to 50. We've got this marginal cost like this, and a 60. So we're going to have a producer surplus here, and consumer surplus here, and deadweight loss is just right here. Okay? So the CS would be a half times the base, which is 50, times the height, 110 minus 60. That's 50 squared over 2, or 1250. The producer surplus is just the area of that rectangle, which is 50 times 60 minus 10, which is just 50 squared, or 2500. And the deadweight loss is going to be equal to a half times the base of this thing. This is hitting here at 100. 100 minus 50 times 60 minus 10. That's just 50 squared over 2. That's 1250. Okay? And this is, that deadweight loss is the potential surplus that is not realized in this market. Okay? Now think of like how much different this market would be if instead the firm were pricing at marginal cost of 10. If we're pricing at a marginal cost of 10, consumers would get all of that surplus. So that 5,000 in surplus would all go to consumers. Producer surplus would be 0, but deadweight loss would also be 0. Okay, so you can think of, this is the inefficiency okay, from the monopoly, but there is a trade-off here. So like you could look at this and think, well, why then does the government give patents to firms to allow them to be a monopolist for a product or allow them to have a copyright on it? And the idea is you give a financial, so it's, and there's a question of like how effective this is, but by giving, so you're a company and you're thinking about whether to do research on a particular drug or a category of drugs, it's expensive, it's uncertain, right? And so you're sort of rolling the dice with doing this research, and part of the reason they do the research is the prospect of discovering something that is genuinely significant, that improves health in a very big way, and that would then give them a monopoly. That's a big financial incentive. If you didn't have patents, firms might not do R&D, and so we might not get, make progress against illnesses. Can you pass this to me? I'll come right back to you in a second. We have one here, Bella.
Can you repeat why the marginal revenue is twice as steep as the price curve?
Why it's twice as steep as the
Yeah.
demand curve? It's just like a mathematical thing. So if I total basically the revenues are going to be equal to that price of 110 minus Q times Q, right? And then if you were to, so we're not doing calculus in the class, but if we were doing calculus, we would differentiate revenue with respect to quantity. And so what that would give you would be, in this case, so the total revenue would be 110 minus Q squared. If I differentiate that, it's 110 minus 2Q. Do you know what I mean? So you could do that for any linear demand curve of A minus BQ. The revenue is AQ minus BQ squared, and so anyway.
Okay, so it's just
it's just a mathematical thing, that the marginal revenue is twice as steep with the same vertical intercept as the demand curve. Yeah, question over here. Same question. Okay, cool. Question here.
So, like in the first few weeks of the class, we were talking about like how the actual deadweight loss might be greater than what's shown on the graph. For like this case in a monopoly, would the actual deadweight loss be greater than what's shown on the graph if there's like a hidden fixed cost that's not realized in like the producer's surplus here?
No, this one's pretty good.
Okay.
This one, yeah, this one is good, but that's a great question. The producer surplus does not include the fixed costs, so this may overstate the firm's profits associated with producing this product. And what firms will say is there are estimates out there that it costs $803 million. I think that's the number. There's a more recent one that's even higher, that's more than $1 billion, that on average the cost to discover a new drug is $803 million. So when you look at a pharmaceutical firm and see that it's making money hand over fist on a treatment, you got to bear in mind that there's this fixed cost in the background. But like what the right patent length should be it be 20 years? Should it be 10? Should it be 50? Should it be 11? That's ultimately an empirical question, and one that is pretty controversial among, different people have very different views on that. Okay, other questions? Okay, when you include the fixed costs, we can see that here the profit is going to depend on the average cost. So here we're setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, but this is the average cost, and the total profit to the firm, which also incorporates the fixed cost, is going to be the area of this rectangle. So basically, the difference between the price and the average cost at that quantity level multiplied by the total quantity that's being produced, okay? So pros and cons of monopolies. So one big pro is that high potential profits encourage innovation. So new pharmaceutical treatments, better search engines, and so forth. So that is a big reason that government policy allows, indeed encourages monopoly in certain areas. Okay, so I think right now there are a lot of companies who are doing research, although fewer now, because there haven't been many successes. There are a lot of companies doing research on drugs to treat Alzheimer's and dementia, and the part of the reason for that is that the world is aging and more people are having this illness, having this condition, and part of the reason they're doing it is the high potential profits associated with discovering a treatment. But so far, no company has really succeeded in coming up with a treatment that makes a significant dent in that, for that illness. Even if innovation isn't a key feature of a market, monopolies can be efficient if there are increasing returns to scale. So we saw that earlier when that example where the total market level demand was intersecting average cost at a point where average cost was still falling. And this is, this is true. You can think of this natural monopolies such as electric utilities perhaps having increasing returns to scale. Is often quite difficult to define the market, and we're going to talk a lot about this in class on Thursday. Like what is, so one of the things that governments do is regulate market power through allowing or not allowing, let's say, mergers and acquisitions. So if the CEOs of United and American Airlines happen to bump into each other and said, you know what we should do? We should merge. The two of us should merge. And we'd be more efficient, we'd be bigger, maybe there's economies of scale, but the government would say to them, absolutely not, because they would have too much market power. And we're going to talk a lot about that issue. But for something like airlines, it's somewhat easier to define the market than it is for industries like, who are the competitors to Amazon, who are the competitors to Google, who are the competitors to Facebook. Those are somewhat challenging to define, and we're going to talk about that. There are possible big efficiency costs from underproduction, from too little production. So at some level, there is too little production of many pharmaceutical treatments because you have a lot of people who are being priced out. And production also often doesn't occur at the minimum of average cost. Okay, and OpenStax does some good examples of AT&T and the East India Company, so I encourage you to have a look at those. And there are dangers of barriers to entry. So if there are barriers to entry in a market, that can lead to a monopoly. Predatory pricing, so sometimes monopolists are thought to price aggressively if any entrant comes in to try to drive them out so they can't make any money. But there are pluses and minuses of monopolies. And like I said, governments discourage monopoly in some situations and encourage monopoly in other situations. And how to get that sort of balance right between how much you want to regulate in one direction or another is, it depends on a lot of factors. And I've alluded to a few of the big ones. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second before starting oligopoly, which is going to be where most markets operate. Any questions on any of this? Questions? Okay, cool, great. Okay, so next we're going to talk about oligopoly, and I think that we are probably going to skip monopolistic competition. I'll refer to it next time, but we're not going to talk much about it just because of time constraints. So we've studied perfect competition and monopoly, but let me hold off on. Let's hold off. I don't want to erase it just yet. So I may get to it next time. So let me step back from that. So we've studied perfect competition and monopoly, which are the two extreme examples of what a market can look like. In practice, most markets are between these two extremes. They're imperfectly competitive. So an oligopoly can exist when there is a small number of firms that account for most sales. So airplane manufacturing with Airbus and Boeing, cell phones with Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint, smartphone operating systems, Apple and Google. And when you have a relatively small number of firms, as we'll see in a bit, firms may have an incentive, a temptation to collude and increase their total profits, okay? Monopolistically competitive firms differ from oligopoly. Here we're thinking of companies making essentially the same thing. With monopolistically competitive firms, there are slightly differentiated products that have mini monopolies, but close substitutes are available, okay? And so free entry with monopolistically competitive firms reduces demand and drives the profits towards zero. So I may talk a little bit about monopolistically competitive firms next time, but we're going to focus mainly on oligopoly when we're thinking of 2, 3, 4 firms that are all making essentially an identical product. So potential causes and consequences of oligopoly. So there may be patents for 2 or more firms, an example of pharmaceutical treatments for specific conditions. So there are certain illnesses that have, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 possible treatments available. So it's not like one of them has a monopoly, but they do have some market power because they have patent protection. So the minimum of the long-run average cost curve could occur, I referred to this a little bit last time, at half of the total market demand. An example of Boeing and Airbus. There could be barriers to entry. So there may be massive advertising expenditures that may be necessary. Or like one market that I have studied a lot in my own research is the health insurance industry. And so in health insurance, it turns out to be a pretty difficult thing to just set up a health insurance company because you've got to set up networks of physicians and hospitals and negotiate rates with them for things, and that can be quite a formidable barrier to entry. And there is a temptation to collude if there are just 2 or 3 firms. So the absolute maximum profits that can be made occurs with a monopoly. But the 2 firms could collude to potentially each produce half of the monopoly quantity, and that could lead to a bad outcome. So what we're going to see, like the key takeaway of this next part, is going to be that when you go from 1 firm to 2 firms, what is going to happen is that output is going to go up and deadweight loss is going to go down. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the math of that. But like one of the reasons that regulators like having 2 or more firms in a market is that it tends to lead to higher quantity, higher consumer surplus, and less deadweight loss. And I'll walk you through the math of that in just a moment. So when there's an oligopoly, it's unclear how the 2 or 3 or 4 firms are going to compete. Will they aggressively drive down the price or instead play nice? And what you're going to see is there can exist a sort of prisoner's dilemma where both can, and I'll walk you through this in a second and come back to this, they may want to hold back on production. So let me just show you graphically the incentive for each firm to increase its quantity. Let's imagine that we have 2 firms in that market from before with the demand of 100 minus Q. And suppose that it's got marginal cost of 20. Okay, so marginal revenue here is 100 minus 2Q. And so if this were a monopoly, 100 minus 2Q equals 20. 2Q equals 80. Q is equal to 40, and P is equal to 60. Okay, so if this were a monopoly, we would be at this point right here, okay? So now let's suppose, I'm going to describe to you here graphically why it is the case that when you have 2 firms competing instead of just 1, we tend to see output go up. Okay, so we said having output of 40 was inefficient because there's all that surplus, that potential surplus to the right that isn't being realized. Okay, so now suppose that we had 2 firms in this market and they were each producing 20. They were each producing the half of the monopoly quantity. Okay, and now think of the trade-off that one of those firms faces in thinking about whether to increase its output from 20 to 21 so that total output would go to 41. They would lose, so this is the revenue gain from having another customer. But they only lose half of that other rectangle, okay? Because they only have 20 units of production, not the full 40 units of production. So for one of these firms, it looks appealing to push their output up a little bit above 20 because they're getting that full rectangle to the right whereas they're only losing half of the rectangle to the left, okay? And so essentially, you could have the two firms colluding in this market saying, let's each produce 20, but they each have an incentive to deviate because they want to produce a little more to get this. And I'll show this instead of graphically, mathematically. Let's consider a market with, okay, so let me pause there for a second, see if this makes sense. You have a question? Yeah, let me see where there, it's back here. Great, thanks. Ooh, sorry, I had spun it.
I'm just wondering why is the game a whole rectangle? Like, wouldn't they share the game as well?
No, because they're getting that 41st unit. They're pushing total output from 40 to 41 by increasing their own from 20 to 21. So they're getting that full additional $59 for that unit. But they're only producing 20 of the 40 full market units. So the monopolist stopped at that point before because those two rectangles were basically the same in terms of their but now in this case, only half of the rectangle to the left matters to them. Okay, so let me walk through this with an example. Okay, so let's consider a market with two firms and suppose that the market demand is described by 24 minus Q. I chose a smaller intercept just to make the math a little easier. And Q is going to be the total output for the market, which is the sum of output by the two firms. And we're going to assume that the firms have the identical marginal cost of 4, and we're going to ignore fixed costs for now. Their profit is going to be maximized when total quantity is equal to 10. How do we know that? Marginal revenue equals 24 minus 2Q. It's equal to marginal cost of 4. 2Q is equal to 20. Total Q is equal to 10. Okay, so the total profits for these two companies is maximized if their total output is 10. So they could each agree to each produce 5. But as I'm going to show in a second, they're each going to have a temptation to produce more than 5. Okay? Sorry. So here is the outcome if this is a monopoly. Basically have, if this were a monopoly, and if they were colluding to effectively be a monopoly, marginal cost of 4, marginal revenue of we said it intersects at 10, okay, and the profits are in this, are the area of that rectangle, okay? So that would be, if they wanted to collude and each produce 5, that could be their total profits. But I said that they're going to want to, each of them is going to want to deviate, and I'll show you this now. Suppose that they were each producing 5. Firm 1 was producing 5 and firm 2 was producing 5. They would each get profits of 50 because the price was at 14 at this point, and the cost for each unit is 4. So for each unit, they're making 10, and total profit is 100. Now suppose that you're firm 2, and you're thinking to yourself, do I want to stick with this deal, this colluding deal that we have? I'm thinking of increasing my output for the reason that I described before. I'm gaining that full rectangle to the right and only losing half of the rectangle to the left. My profits go from 50 to 54. Sure, my competitor loses 5 in profits and total profits fall, but I'm better off going from 50 to 50 with higher profits, deviating from this deal. Similarly, if my competitor was still producing 5, I'd even want to go to 7 And there, once again, my profits go up again. So each firm has an incentive to produce more than the half of the monopoly quantity. And this is, at a simple level, this explains why regulators like to have 2 firms or 3 firms or 4 firms in a market much more than one, because you're going to tend to get more output and less deadweight loss as a result. And you can walk through this example and basically create the payoffs to each firm from 2 situations. Suppose that we give, the firms are trying to decide whether to produce 5 units each or 7 units each. Okay? If I think of it from the perspective of firm 2, they can choose either an output of 5 or an output of 7. And their payoffs are given by the second term in these parenthetic expressions, okay? So you can see that in both cases, whether firm 1 does 5 or firm 1 does 7, their payoffs are higher from producing 7 than from producing 5, okay? And that's true for both firms. And so both firms optimize in this example by setting quantity to 7 instead of quantity of 5. It's a kind of prisoner's dilemma. They're both worse off. They'd be better off if they could cooperate and each hold back their production, collude to produce 5 units. But given what the other firm, what my competitor is doing, either way, it's better for me to pick 7 units of output, okay? Now, firms can, in the real world, firms can enforce collusion because you're thinking about not just today's profits, but tomorrow's profits and in the future, okay? But you can see here why a firm profit maximizing, trying to do the best they can given what their competitor is doing, but that's going to tend to lead to an increase in output, okay? And so you can go through this here, basically just gives the profits for each firm and shows that neither firm, when they're both producing 7, neither firm has an incentive to deviate from that. So it's kind of an equilibrium. This is an equilibrium in this market where total output, instead of being 10, is 14. We're going to have less deadweight loss than we had previously and more consumer surplus. Okay, so if you think of the case where, suppose we go back to that prisoner's dilemma example where both are producing 7, does either have an incentive to deviate? Well, let's think about firm 2. If they produce less, their profits don't go up at all. If they produce more, so less go from 7 to 6. If they produce more, their profits go down, so they don't have any incentive to deviate from this, okay? So this is an equilibrium. Each firm is optimizing given what the other firm is doing, okay? Neither one has an incentive to deviate, whereas that 5-5 situation isn't really, it's hard to sustain it because you kind of want to cheat. If the 2 companies were trying to collude and produce the monopoly level, and so this is, at a very simple level, this is why regulators tend to prefer having multiple firms in an industry as opposed to just one. So in the monopoly example, we had a quantity of 10 and a price of 14, whereas with an oligopoly, we have just going from 1 to 2 firms, our output goes up by a lot, from 10 to 14. Price falls. Producer surplus is now 84. So producer surplus has come down a lot. Consumer surplus has doubled, almost doubled. And deadweight loss has fallen all the way down to 18. So you can draw this graphically. If you think of, here's quantity, here's price, 24, 4, 24. So in this case, the price, instead of being at 14, is at 10. So we're getting much more consumer surplus than before, less producer surplus, and the deadweight loss is much lower than before. This intersects at 14. This intersects at 20. So basically here, the deadweight loss is a half times 6 times 6, or 18. Okay, the deadweight loss previously, I believe, was 50 in the previous example. So that's a big reduction in the inefficiency of this market. And by this same kind of rationale, as you go from 2 firms, this will be my last slide, if you go from 2 firms to 4 firms, you end up getting even more total output. So total output ends up going from 14 to 16 when you go to 4 firms, and no firm has an incentive to deviate there. So in general, the more firms that we have, the lower the price will be, the lower the deadweight loss will be, and we're going to talk more about this trade-off next time. Hope you have a great rest of the week. And if you're signed up for the Jason Furman lunch, could you please make sure to be on time, SEPR, 3rd floor, SEPR building, and let me know if you're not sure where to go. And have a great rest of your day.